Annique and I are presenting IAPMA's virtual event, and it's very, very exciting. It's the first of the studio events, and Annique and I met in 2011 when we were both studying at Southern Cross University. And in 2012, there was 3 students who we all were given a Hollander beater, and we were bequeathed this beater and some equipment to make banana fibre. Now, we kept going with our paper adventures. I went to the USA and was part of the paper book intensive in 2013. And Annique was selected for a residency aboard the tall ship Svalbard. I hope I pronounced that right, in the high Arctic. And she did experiments in paper in the polar regions and collected research for her doctorate. The thematic connections between the two of us in our arts practice intersects with the themes of climate, responding to climate change, and water, which is of course a vital ingredient in paper making. At the beginning of this year, Annique was selected, Annique started a social engagement project at St Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne. Now, this is before lockdown. It's called Living Water, Birang Yara Speaks. And so Annique's going to kick off the presentation with this amazing project that she's been undergoing. And of course, she hasn't actually been able to get down to Melbourne again since she installed it because of the lockdown. So just to introduce, sorry, we started and I didn't introduce myself. I'm Heather Matthew, I'm the Secretary of IAPMA, and Annique Goldenberg is an IAPMA member. So this is kicking off the virtual IAPMA studio visits. So over to you, Annique.
Thank you very much, Heather. First of all, Annie said that she can't hear anyone. Annie, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Annie? It's not looking good. Is everybody else able to hear me and Heather? So if you can't, oh well, if you can't yet, can everyone? Okay, I'm sorry, we seem to have a couple of computer GIFs coming, and I'm talking to you here from Brunswick Heads, which is on Bundjalung country, and I'd like to make acknowledgement to the Bundjalung elders, to them and their knowledge on this, their land. I'm very excited to have been invited. Thank you very much to Heather and to IAPMA for inviting me to speak today. I'm just going to do a very brief little slideshow first to put a bit of context of what I've been doing with my paper research. And then I'll switch to my website and put it in February in St Paul's Cathedral. So I'm going to share my screen now, and it worked earlier. Let's hope it's working now. For all now seeing a slide that is actually frozen kelp up in the high Arctic, and that's where this whole Living Water series research with which uses a lot of paper exploration started. So I'm just gonna get that working. What I've discovered, it started, as I said, in 2017 in the high Arctic. And that same year I visited various places in Europe, and in that same year we had Cyclone Debbie here on the east coast of Australia. And it was this, I suddenly realized that there was started to be this trajectory down through the latitude, starting at 80 degrees north. Oh, that's, I can hear somebody talking. So then it took probably to start to realize what was happening with that residency. So here's Svalbard, which is Norwegian, and it is up north of Norway. And this is the vessel, sailing vessel Antigua, that myself and 29 other researchers, artists, creatives, historians from around the world, this really remote region. It was an extraordinary experience. We're still friends today, and some have already done some collaborations together. And I have actually been invited to be part of a Women in the Arctic next year by another participant from a different year, and she invited a few, Barbara Crawford, who invited a few of us to take part in this collegiate experience that she's picked up on there. So I'll just get this to go down. Another of my images from this beautiful extraordinary place. It touches you very deeply in different ways. The thing we had in common was we are all focused and concerned with climate change in whatever our area of discipline was. Small experiments with making paper using the melted ice water while I was up there. My pulp source was toilet paper, because on a ship you don't have very much equipment and space available to you, so toilet paper was something that melted very quickly, and I made very simple experiments. I collected field data in all sorts of ways, with photographs and video, frottage on the ice, and I made a lot of ice melt ink drawings with from water and ice out, being there, being open to the experience, not having any known outcomes at that point, so that you could be really present. One which was just a little journal, and all of the participants put in a page, whether it was a poem, like a diary entry, a little painting, and that memorandum has become extremely important to my memories of that experience. I did, as I said, I collected waters and put ice and ink and melted them in petri dishes. Petri dishes, so there was a practical reason, but it's also, it has about science and that art science overlap. And what happens with these ice ink drawings is they melt, the ice melts in it the way it chooses, it dries, and then the ambient air temperature and environment can react, freeze it, dry it, whatever the condition point. I scan them and then greatly enlarge them, and then I digitally manipulate them and overlay them with the imagery, the photographs taken. And I call these drawings or these digital images Arctic integrations. And I had collected water in Kent in the UK, and I put a green ink with that. I collected water from the Dead Sea, which was a white ink, and then in the Arctic it was a turquoise ink. Distinguish, and what happens in these digital images in the end is that it's overlaying and overlapping waters from these different regions symbolically. But of course, the whole point is that water links us and connects us around the world, regardless of where we are. So as I mentioned, glacial melt and just this the impact of humans on our planet, we had this extreme weather event, and it affected a property of ours in Lismore. I found I wasn't wanting to to connect so much with the destruction. It was more the rebuild and regeneration and the patterning that I found after the flood. And this freshly plastered wall, which is still holding within the Besser blocks, and the empty doorway, the filled-in doorway. This for me was somehow more symbolic of what we were experiencing, layer of story of how we have been affected by water and flood and how we move on. So 2 years later, in 2019, and one was this Arctic room moving into darkness. And this is where I first really started to experiment very large scale with drawing with paper pulp. So on the size and shape of the Arctic ice cap, the month that I was in the Arctic, and I drew it with recycled, I got old white sheets from the Lismore op shops, and they were cotton, and I pulped them back down in this fabulous Hollander beater we have. My doctorate at Queensland College of the Arts, and very fortunate to have paper-making equipment there, which was put together by Dr. Tim Mosley, as Heather mentioned. He actually taught us originally years earlier how to make paper at Southern Cross Uni, and then I reconnected with him up in Brisbane at Queensland College of the Arts. So we have this extraordinary Hollander drawing the Arctic ice cap on the floor. I put this ultraviolet light on, and as I was drawing, I just had a quick look to see how it was responding differently, and you could really start to see the vortexes which make up the Arctic ice cap. So as I said, that was a first experiment that's drawing directly onto the floor, performance to push it all together, and then that pulp then was dried in another vessel and has become an Arctic book. And that Arctic book is going to be the holder of memory and experience. If I go back to my, so the other room was the flood room. If you saw this, which was a second very large scale piece of paper. So that's 8 meters long by 2.5 meters wide, and it's made again using recycled cotton bed sheets from Lismore op shops, along with the mud. So when we had the flood, I collected mud from that event, and the water used in my paperworks is really as important, the materiality of these works. And so that piece is made with Lismore flood mud and sheets, and the red line you see is a level that very, very slowly goes up and down, which is kind of the overwhelm of flood. When it's down on what I came to see as the floodplain, it dances and produces these beautiful patterns, and reminded me, the paper itself in the exhibition reminded me that of course floods and floodplains are essential, and it's not a work with my materials and my environment, it's a co-creation, it's a partnership. And in the background there you can see this work, which is called To Account, and that has flood mud in a little tank. And I made a projection of Greta Thunberg's very iconic speech, where we just haven't been listening, and the project in Auslan, the speech, she translated it into Auslan, and we're just personal. So all of that brought me down through the latitudes, and it was a conversation at that previous exhibition, a chance conversation with Dr. Catherine Firth, who was there giving some masterclasses. And I said I wanted to go to Melbourne, maybe, or Sydney, and maybe exhibit that work. Cathedrals, and I said, well, I'm fine. And she said, well, write to this person, and gave me an email address. And she said, he will respond because he's my husband. And it's these sorts of conversations and these sorts of events that that happen with the work, and it's about this connection. So yes, Dr. Andreas Lohr, he did respond, and when I went to meet him, I hadn't realized that when I first was from the Yarra River, and as I've now been given permission, it's the Birrarung Yarra River in the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung language, and the elders have given me permission to use that. And for me, that's really important to be able to connect and share with that story and the naming of the river. So we quickly realized it wasn't about the it was about creating a new site-specific work, and it started with his community and makers of Victoria, some of whom I think are here, and other artists and members of Melbourne's community. And this is the final installation, which I'm going to talk about a bit more in a moment, and I'll just go down to this final slide because the collecting the river water, and you can see the spires of St. Paul's in the background there, and then collecting their stories, and then pouring the paper, and that's actually Heather in the blue, and she'll be talking more about that. So I'm just going to go to this page, and I hope I'm doing all right for time. So this page about the Birrarung, installation, and it was a participatory process, very much where the participants shared their stories of their relationship with St. So very briefly, and you can read all of this on the story, the Yarra actually was named that by a surveyor back in 1835 when he was pointing at the river, and was told it's actually means fast flowing water or waterfall, and he was actually standing near, there was a waterfall down near the Queen Street Bridge at that time, and that was a very important crossing place for the different Indigenous came to that area. So below the Yarra, this waterfall, the Yarra Yarra, there would have been salt water going out into the bay, and above it would have been fresh water by running about 100 years ago or so. These waterfalls, the bridges were built over the river over the next decades, and then the waterfall was done. And so as a result, that water that runs past St. Paul's is brackish, it's salty, and it completely changed the environment. So that was part of the story that I learned in the making of this process. And as a result, the real name or the original name of the river is Birrarung, and with this discussion with the elders, put two names together. Living Water, as you've seen, is the name of the series of these different group works. So I started with making presentations to the different groups of paper makers of Victoria, and I suppose what I've been sharing with you pretty much. Then one of the ways they participated was to bring their fabric. It had to be linen or cotton, as most. And we had a day in the cathedral, and we had a day at the Papermakers of Victoria, where they brought in, and again, it was they share their stories about these bits, these pieces of clothing. There's one, I was gifted this old hymnal by St. Paul's, and in fact, this cover went on to become a cover for an artist's book that emerged out of the project. Prayer book. There's this beautiful piece of calico that would have been somewhere in the altars, so it was quite an old soft calico when it was pulped down. There was some linen and cotton alder cloths from the cathedral in advance, which, and it was this linen, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment actually. We had a day of collecting river water just across the road. People came down to collect the river water from the Yada, that's the Dean. He came down early on, and with the priest centre, Heather Pataka. Talitha on the right there was, I worked with at the cathedral, and she's also a poet. It was just lovely. There were all these other elements. So the jars that people collected the water in became an element. The labels became an element. And all of these went together to collect river water. And this is a friend, and she's watching right now, might recognize. Here we are. So just a few beautiful shots. Juliet Russell. You can see the spires in the background. And I'll just move on from that back to the story. Another element, this whole, I'm not sure why I'm not going back to the story, sorry. Having some internet issues. There we go. Was collecting recordings. Might have been people's voices, and that was also the river's voice. This is a little homemade hydrophone, and sounds, especially when you've got rowers going by, strokes of the river, of their sculls. You can hear recordings from Flinders Street Station coming through the water. You hear sort of little picky noises, which are creatures underneath the water. And then also recording above the water, just the sounds that we would recognize of river. So there were recordings from near the cathedral, and then further upstream where you have the fresher water and clear, and the clarity. So there's this happening, and then there were people, recordings of people. Most of those were done down either next to the river on the day they came to bring their water, or the paper makers recorded some when I was at their meeting. Extraordinary knowledge was shared with me, and all of these recordings were put together into a soundscape by Paul McKee, who's up here as a sound engineer, and that soundscape now plays in the installation. The other way I expressed these recordings was through this piece of paper here. From the white linen and cotton from the cathedral, and I then typed on some extra pieces some of little moments from people's recordings, and you can, and they, the pinned ones, you can see quite clearly that they're added into this sort of white riverscape. You might be able to just make out some words here. The glued ones, they almost started to sink into this beautiful paper. This is the cotton, the cathedral cotton. This very clear, fine is the linen, and that paper became very important to bind all of the different pulps together. I'm going to move quickly now to the pulping and the pouring, and then I shall wind up. Sorry, again, I seem to be having some internet issues. So you can all go my website. You'll see there's a section of those pulping those cathedral fabrics. You can get a view of what the Hollander Beta up at QCA looks like. You can also see when I pulp paper makers of Victoria's fabulous studios. I became a member down there in Melbourne in the stables, and you can get a sense of all the different, they also helped me with the cutting up of the fabric. And then of course there's the tech works that were involved. This is not quite the full length, but almost the full length of the paper. It was poured, and I'll come to that now, in the coach house, which is where the Dean and his wife live. So circle the person who'd introduced me to this location. You can just make out a herringbone pattern on the floor there. That's the floor of the coach house. And it's just, again, layer upon layer, story upon story, becoming embedded, which was poured jar by jar. And those patterns were determined because it was poured jar by jar. And again, this is an important part of my work, that the of this 8 meter by 2 meter piece of work is the look of it, the aesthetic of it comes out of the different colored pulps. And you've got the white cathedral linen through it, which is kind of giving it a strength. So all of these color makers amongst us know are made from recycled fabrics. I did not add any other dyes to them, and they created this sort of mist and shadows, dappled river surfaces. How it felt for me very much. And again, as I said, that came out of the method of that particular one of pouring it jar by jar. You will see on my website, if you're in peeled, and then the final one is the installation, where I brought together the 8 meter sheet of paper, which is installed. Actually, I know I'm jumping about a little bit. Going to go back to the final installation. The 8 meter piece of paper is installed in the McCartney Chapel in the cathedral, underneath a stained glass window of the Samaritan woman talking to Jesus about is collecting water from the well, and they're talking about living water. It's these synchronistic moments that are always exciting and delightful. You have the soundtrack of the recordings of the river and humans. Sheet of paper, which is the human soundtrack, and then underneath the paper you have the jars, because they're all important elements in the installation. And that's it, Heather. If you want to come back in, if that's my quick. The Birrarung Living Water Birrarung speaks.
Okay, thank you, Annique. You just need to unpin, you just need to stop your share now, Annique. Can you stop your screen share now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was sorry if everybody couldn't hear. I know it's been a bit of a tricky one with Annique's internet audio. We've done a lot of practices and we were hoping it might work a little bit better, but yes, there was probably quite a bit of audio you didn't catch. However, I'm hoping that you can hear me okay, and it's great to see this incredible development of a project from that concept, that sort of seed of an idea, and then into its development. And I'm going to share a little bit about my kind of concept to development. And I've got a little video, so just bear with me while I set up my little screen here. And okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. You just have to wait while I get my movie happening, because I couldn't show it. Okay, play full screen. So I'm going to show you this, but before I do, well, it's called Adventuring with Paper. So the exciting thing about this is that one of the things that Annique and I had in common as well was that our studios got flooded by that Cyclone Debbie in 2017. And I also went on to create work with flood mud. My default practice has been collage, and continues to, I continue to use elements of collage and stitching in my work. And you can see then my progression through this idea from that time here. So I love to travel, which is why I've got that world there. In 2018, I went around 3 months with my husband and a backpack. We went all around Europe. I went to the IAPMA Congress in Bulgaria and then travelled around from there. Every day I made a postcard of where I had travelled to. And these postcards here, this is of Glastonbury, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about this one. So a lot of it was that I had a little bit of the feature of the place highlighted in focus and perhaps the name of the place. And the rest of it was collage from found papers that I'd found that day or along the journey. I actually met Annique in Glastonbury that year in 2018. She was in the UK for something. I was in the UK for that one day of being at Glastonbury. I was in a little camper van with my husband, and we parked in the supermarket car park at Glastonbury, and she said to me, "Oh, could I get one of your postcards?" And I went, "Yeah, okay, I'll make one up for you right now." I said, I'll post it to you in an envelope. She said, no, post it to me in the post. I'm going, "You sure?" And she said, "Yes, post it to me in the post, and all the postage kind of marks will be on the postcard." Well, I took a photo of it before it went, and unfortunately, because I was traveling with a glue stick, all the pieces came off of the postcard, and the actual postcard was all she got. So collage and travel has been a really big element in my practice. So in 2019, last year, I went to Iceland for an artist residency about water, really, and the ice. I'm carried with me that little tiny mold and decal in my backpack and made small pieces of paper, which I then kind of scrunched. I monoprinted other paper and put it with it. Now what's happened? What's happened? Why is it not working? Okay, it's stopped sharing. It's, here we go. And there is the, oh, am I still sharing this? Can you still see? Hang on. I'm hoping that you can still see my screen. Can you can't see my screen. Okay. Well, there's always something, isn't there? Okay. I'm going to start from here again, and I'm going to try and share my screen again. And yeah, always seems to be some little thing. But hey, we're in the land of the internet these days. So let's see if we go from there. Now, hopefully you can see my screen, and I should be able to see you in the chat. Let me check my chat. Okay, I can see you, Heather. Okay, all right. So I'm going to try and show my screen again. For some reason, it didn't, it stopped at that point. There we go. So that's what I was making, these, and for some reason, I'll just keep going. It might go a little bit further. It seems to stop at that point. There we go. So I cooked up some banana fibre. No, sorry, banana. Seaweed. There was lots of seaweed there. I cooked it up and I collected fishing nets, and I kind of poured the seaweed into the fishing nets and put some fishing nets in the paper. I was doing quite a bit of experimentation. And I also did a big seaweed pour. You can see the seaweed on the ground, on the wall. Now, then it snowed. It was the most beautiful place when it was snowing. And I was at a heated swimming pool, and I saw the lights at nighttime in the snow, and that inspired me to bury some paper in the snow and kind of try to recreate those lights that I saw. So I also saw the Northern Lights. So I was really inspired by this. I also went to the Imagine Peace Tower lighting, and I'll talk a bit about that. So that was on October the 9th last year. And I really felt like I was holding the light, and I was actually live streaming. When I came back to Australia, the bushfires had, this is in November, the bushfires had put silt and soot all over the beach. So I collected it and I made some paper, a bit like the Icelandic paper. I made paper, but I put soot and ash into it and leaves that were washed up. And I put it into a fishing net that I had. And that was part of an exhibition that I was selected for in Melbourne. This is again in January. Now, the other thing was that when I was in America in 2013, I went to this paper book intensive and I went and did the big ass Kozo paper workshop. I always wanted to make big paper, but I didn't know how. I was inspired by Annique. And so then I went to, excuse me, I went to the an artist residency in the Blue Mountains, and I thought, right, now or never, there's a big space. I was inspired by helping Annique with her big pour in the garage for her river. And I thought, right. And I was trying to respond to the bushfires at Bilpin, but by this stage, it was like the 3rd or 4th, was like the first week in March. And people were starting to talk about COVID. And for some reason, I then started making this big white paper circle with orange in it, and it almost looked like the COVID circles. When I got home, I started making these small pieces of paper on a silk screen, a poured paper pulp with kind of jigsaw parts of the world. And then I thought, what if I make some paper pour in my garage? I'll just try it out like I did with the seaweed pour. And they started to look like kind of waves. And when I pulled them off, they looked like glaciers. Then I thought, right, I'm going to try a big world in my garage. And it was huge. It was bigger than me. So that got me then to think about what else I could do with my Iceland inspiration, because I wasn't going anywhere. I had booked to go to Iceland again. But once that was called off, I thought, right, I'm going to relive my memories of Iceland. And so I screen printed this pattern of water waves onto a map of Iceland. I really liked what it looked like because it looked like the lava fields that I'd looked at and I'd walked over. So I screen printed that and I thought, right, I have enough work here to have another exhibition. So I applied for an exhibition, and this piece is I forgot to say, when I made that big circle of poured paper pulp when I was at the Blue Mountain residency, it was still wet, and then they called the residency off. They said, everybody has to go home. The big circle of paper was only half dry, and I had to put it on a big board and put it on the back of the car. And when I pulled it out, when I got home, it was pretty well damaged. So I kind of crunched it up and just left it. When I started thinking about the exhibition for Iceland, I thought, oh, what about lights in the snow, those snow flowers I'd made when I was in Iceland? And so that inspired this big piece to be crunched up and ink put into it. And then I also put little tea lights into it as well. And so this then became my Fire and Ice exhibition that I've just had on. And there are the glaciers that you saw being poured and the tea lights, and there's the light coming through like in Iceland. I also did some sort of more folded sculptural pieces, and this was inspired by the famous church in Reykjavik that you can see from every street. It's like this, the highest point in Iceland. If you look at any pictures of Iceland and Reykjavik, this church stands out. It was also the triangular shape was also inspired by the church in Skagastron where I was. I can't pronounce the name of that. So here's my exhibition, all hanging up in Murwillumbah, and you can see everything on the back there. And then, because it was all taking place around about a year exactly after I had been in Iceland, this is when I wanted to do an activation. Now, this is a collage I did on an envelope when I was traveling in Iceland. So in 2019, I wasn't doing postcards. I was creating collages, daily collages on envelopes. And this was all pieces of paper that I got on the night when I was handing out flyers about the illumination of the Peace Tower. It was such a big and important event for me to be there at that time in Iceland when the lighting of the Peace Tower happened, that I wanted to bring an activation to Murwillumbah. So here it is. So I thought, what if I do it as a collaborative work? So other people joined in as well. And then we sang Imagine and lit candles. And 2 days later, I took it off the sheet. And it did get a bit torn, and somebody walked on it when it was wet, so I had to patch it up. You can see the footprints there on the left in different coloured pulp. So it was then hung up on the wall in Murwillumbah. And so that was inspired by my Ness artist residency. And so one little thing, escape. Well, so one little thing led to that project. So yeah, I guess I was very inspired by Annique's work, and so I wanted to make sure that I could do the same and have something that really could take that idea of an activation for the world to bring peace to the world, and I see paper as doing that as well. So that's it from me, because we want to have a little bit of time to have some question and answers, and hopefully everybody can use the chat, and I should be able to answer you. If anybody has some questions.
They can maybe they can unmute them.
Yeah, you can unmute yourself. Yeah.
Ask it and mute back up. It didn't quite all come off, but this is the postcard that Heather talked about that I insisted she send through the post.
So I'll just put speaker view back on. Yeah.
But it holds that story.
Yeah. So if anybody wants to ask anything, we can bring you on. Put it in the chat that you'd like a question. If you've got any questions, come on. We've got 10 minutes before we have to finish, and we'd love some questions because we're pretty passionate about paper, and you can see that paper really can take you on a great adventure. And the big, you wouldn't think that it was so strong and resilient paper. And I guess that's what I was trying to show in these big pulp pours of the world, that even though we think paper is quite fragile, it's very strong, and it can be used as a metaphor. Well, I use it as a metaphor for our resilience as well. So,
Oh, no. Yeah, I agree with what Heather says when she talks about the metaphorical possibility of paper. Do we have? Can I hear somebody waiting to say a question? No, I'm imagining it.
no, everybody's very silent. They're not saying anything. Come
no,
on.
the question from Annie. We've got some questions here. I don't know who you're, well, for myself, Tim, no, I don't. I only use the color of the materials that I'm using, whether they be the plant or the recycling of clothing. Heather, do you use any dyes?
Not usually. I use the color of the clothing, but on the ones that I did, the first little COVID circle ones, I tried adding some red dye into the not into the pulp in the Hollander, but actually when the circle was still forming, I added some pulp just to see what would do, because I felt like everything was really red and everybody was like very anxious and there was this huge anxiety. So I wanted to express this with red. And then as I kept making these circles of paper, I started to feel calmer, because paper is the whole act of